salary, and up until a couple of years ago I was a full-time negotiator with the trade union. Since when I've been working with my own business, doing dispute resolution and helping organisations to work more constructively and positively with their staff. And what I'd like to do is to take you through my take on negotiations in the modern workplace, particularly focusing around the whole concept of collective bargaining. So in these sessions, what I'd like to get you to learn and understand is about where collective bargaining fits into the context with other negotiation scenarios, the type of things that you've been learning about elsewhere in the course. Also look at the legal, historical, cultural, etc. frameworks around it. Understand some of the vocabulary that's used in collective bargaining, because not everything means exactly what it sounds like it means. Then have a look at how collective bargaining operates, particularly looking at some of the pitfalls that can be fallen into, and have a look at some of the alternative approaches that are available to undertake these collective discussions that need to happen. So the question is, as a starting point, what is collective bargaining? Starting point for me with that kind of thing, I look for a definition, I look it up in the dictionary. So, what does the Cambridge English Dictionary say about collective bargaining? Okay, we've got the definition there on screen. It's a system with a group of employees discussing with their employer to try and agree on things like pay and working conditions. Okay. Oxford English Dictionary takes a slightly different take on it. It's negotiation of wages and other conditions of employment. So there's a lot of overlap there by an organised body of employees. And I think the organised body is a subtle difference in there. So what does that mean? Generally would be taken as meaning involving trade unions, but there are other ways of organising employees as well. So where do we go from there? What things would be included in the types of negotiation that I'm thinking of? Collective negotiation, the focus is generally on workplace collective negotiation. So the classic things that would be included are things like pay, terms and conditions, which would include health and safety, which is a lot of the roots of trade unionism come from health and safety, and aiming to make sure that people go home from work as healthy as they went to work in the morning. Union recognition, grading and pay structures, policies and procedures that the organisation operates, if they're facing redundancies, changes in economics and things like that. Flexible working is a growing area of discussion between management and their staff, as are shift rotas and how you operate those things. And expenses are a recurring theme as well, things that you incur in the line of your work, including some obscure things such as animal allowances, etc., if those are necessary for the job that somebody is doing, etc., because pretty much anything that affects somebody in their day-to-day work could be up for negotiation, and the best way to do that, the simplest way to do that, would generally be on a collective basis. So, how does collective bargaining differ from other negotiations? Well, the actual basic nuts and bolts of the negotiation is actually very similar. You've already covered some of the basic theories of negotiation, and those would be applicable in a collective bargaining situation. The context is what makes it slightly different. So you've got small p political and large p political things to take into account. Large p political being the ones that relate to party politics and sort of the government, etc. Small p political being the ones that are the nuances with the personalities who are involved around the table. And there are some practical differences as well in terms of the information available and things like that. And we'll come back to consider that in a bit more detail. There's also legal context and various constraints, because the negotiation can perhaps not take place in quite the way that you might want it to, because there is a government policy or a change in the law, or there may be something else like a board direction or something in a private company which prevents the negotiation from taking place in a completely free and open manner. So there are constraints that maybe need to be taken into account from external parties. The other thing to bear in mind with collective bargaining is the perception of it. and there's a massive hangover from the 1970s in terms of the perception of industrial relations and collective bargaining. For example, only a couple of weeks ago, Red Dwarf Series 12 was screening in episode 4, a scenario where there was an abandoned ship, the crew were abandoning the ship and decided to leave the vending machines. All the vending machines, obviously in a science fiction setting like that, have got personalities, and they decided that they didn't like being left behind. So when everyone returned to the ship, they immediately jumped to taking strike action. There was no negotiation, there was no discussion, it was straight to strike. And that's very much what the perception of industrial relations was from the 1970s. Now, you can argue about how much truth there was that even in the 1970s, but certainly it doesn't seem to reflect the experience of modern industrial relations, and we'll come back to that later on as well. The other factor in there, in terms of particularly the perception, is the media view of industrial relations. Generally, they only are interested in the big stories, so they're only really interested in the industrial action, the fights, especially if it's a strike action, and especially if there's a potential negative aspect that they can actually focus on. So they will then generally portray either management as being draconian, or more commonly that the workforce are being completely unreasonable, and very often they will portray it as both. Because for them, at the end of the day, it's all about making a story. So, worth moving on to look at some of the historical models and what are the origins of our existing industrial relations landscape and the structure within which we do collective bargaining. Way back in the mists of time, there was the Joint Industrial Committee, and that covered things very centrally, very collectively. But there was a risk perceived in the run-up to and during the First World War that if the workers were going to take industrial action, then that could actually cripple the war effort. So a politician called John Whitley was tasked by Parliament to pull together a report looking at the ways that management and staff could interact in order to minimise the risk of strike action or other forms of industrial action. And from the report on relations of employers and employees that he produced, which completed in 1917, he proposed this structure. A formalised approach with management on one side, staff on the other, and they would have a discussion that was based around particular ground rules, and that was known as the Whitley Council. And that has been massively influential across the world in terms of industrial relations, and it's the model that's established industrial relations in the likes of Canada, Australia, as well as in the UK. More recently, from Whitley Councils, there's been a move in towards joint negotiating and consultative committees. That's largely influenced by a greater collaboration with European models of operating, and also the information and consultation of employees regulations, which I'll mention again later on. Within that structure, there's also the option to have staff or works councils, and actually sometimes they are European works councils, depending on the nature of the organisation that you're talking about. And those are very much the growth areas. Particularly partnership is a newer kind of model whereby there's a drawing together of the objectives and the interests of management and staff. And working together towards things, so you end up with a greater consensus, can provide some real benefits. And of course that's rooted in and following on from some of the work that's been done through the European Works Councils, which is a very common model on the continent, particularly in Germany. And I've suggested some background reading that would give you a bit more information about that particular approach. I mentioned earlier on about industrial action, and I really can't leave this presentation without talking about it a bit more. And as you can see, I'm describing it as the elephant in the room. Well, Why is it the elephant in the room? It's ever present and it's part of the perception. But I think it's worth looking at some of the figures around industrial action and how big an issue is it in reality. So records started in December 1931 and they're continued to be compiled by the Office of National Statistics, and that's where the figures that I'm about to go through come from. So if you look at peak industrial action was in April 1980, at which point there were 32.2 million working days lost in the 12 months to that date. So yes, quite a considerable number of days that were being lost. But how does that compare with what's happened since then? Well, if you look at the more recent figures, the year to March 2011, there were only 143,000 lost working days. So there's two order of magnitude drop in terms of the number of days that are being lost to strike action through that. So you can see there's been a considerable change in the approach between organisations and the staff that they employ and the unions that they're negotiating with. Taking that right up to date, the most recent figures that I have available through ONS are for the year to August 2017. And that shows a marginal increase, but still historically low level. So 298,000 working days. Only 80 stoppages, so there were only 80 strikes that were actually involved, and there were only 47,000 people who were involved in that, so which indicates actually that those were taking place sometimes at the same employer, quite often as part of the same actual dispute, just a different strike action taking place as part of it. The question is, why is it an option at all? And that's kind of rooted in our basic human rights. So if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights, under the UDHR, Article 23 covers the right to desirable work and to join trade unions, while Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights is addressing freedom of assembly and association. Now, there's been case law under both of those articles, which has established that it is a basic human right for somebody who is providing work for an employer to withdraw that work if there is something that they need to do that for. And it would have to be for legitimate reasons, obviously, but to assert your human right by withdrawing your labour is a basic human right. Having said that, it should be an option of absolute last resort. However, you then go in and look at the situation, well, why are there industrial action ballots? And actually, a lot of the time, it's a negotiating tactic. For example, if you look at the ongoing situation between Royal Mail and the Communication Workers Union, the headlines about it a few weeks ago were very much Royal Mail is facing its first strike action for many years. But if you look at what's actually happening, effectively there is still a dispute resolution process within the pay agreement that those two parties have to go through. So in actual fact, the Royal Mail is not facing an industrial action and a strike. What it's facing is a union that has sought the opinion of their members, who have said that they would be prepared to take strike action if it came to that. So it's part of the negotiation. It's part of establishing a body of opinion so that the negotiation can continue and can still come out with a satisfactory outcome that does not necessarily involve taking any kind of industrial action, let alone necessarily having a strike. Of course, it might do because it's now an option, but it's all there as part of the negotiation. Of course, the situation in relation to all of that is changing. In 2016, the current government brought forward the Trade Union Act, which they said was to address the issue of striking action and the impact that was having on the public. I think you could potentially question that based on the figures that I've already covered in relation to the impact of strike and the number of strikes that are taking place. But in spite of the changes that have been brought in there, it's notable that actually the ballot by Communication Workers Union went through without a problem. So actually what they've done is they've just adapted to the new legal ground that they have to work within, and they've established that position that they can actually continue with that as a negotiating tactic. So what conclusions would I like you to draw from all of this? Okay, well, I think the first one is, and the most important one probably, is don't believe the hype. So the stuff that's covered in the press, bear in mind that there is very often, if not always, an untold story in the background. So it's worth keeping your ears and eyes open to see, well, what are the nuances that give you an indication of what the story in the background might be. Don't take things at face value. It's also worth bearing in mind that there are a whole range of alternative models that you can refer to and that might actually make things a bit better. So industrial relations isn't a one-size-fits-all situation. And the other thing to bear in mind is that there's a whole range of vocabulary, a number of terms that I've probably used as I've been going through in this, that don't necessarily mean what they immediately sound like they should mean. So next time I'll come back and I'll explain a bit of the vocabulary. Now, there is a list of reading, and I'll put up on the screen just a few of the references, but it's worth doing a bit of background reading as well.